National symbol of patriotism and pride. They stood for unity and not a hateful divide. But I noticed something curious about that mountain. I don't see no Democrats as I sit there counting. You bitches are the party of division and hate.
When we hear the strangest stories in the annals of missing persons cases, we often attribute them to a single person or, in rare instances, a small group of people who seem to drop off the face of the earth. However, it is almost unheard of for an entire village to seemingly vanish. That is what our next story will focus on. The bizarre and chilling disappearance of a small settlement located in the northern tundra of Canada's untamed wilderness. This is the enigma of the vanishing village.
Dr. Alden, 7204.
So how's that new patient doing, nurse? Did you get him to talk anymore?
Still the same, doctor. Says his name is LaBelle, but his story never wavers. He swears he was wandering near the Yukon territory and that a whole group of villages just vanished. He's pretty shaken up over it.
All right, I'll see if I can get a hold of some Mounties. Get him over here, maybe give him a run over. That's about all we can do at the moment.
Joseph LaBelle was an experienced and rugged outdoorsman and knew his way around the inhospitable trappings of the terrain of Canada's Northwest Territories. A time into his latest hunting expedition, he was canoeing downriver, spurred on by the fact that he was running dangerously low on rations. The weather was unseasonably warm, and this seemed to throw a wrench into the local ecosystems, disrupting normal patterns in the wildlife. As such, LaBelle saw little luck in tracking any game. Knowing that he would have to restock on supplies, he set off in the direction of a nearby Inuit village that he was somewhat familiar with. As the last embers of sunlight began to descend, LaBelle finally spotted a plume of distant smoke hovering over the trees. But as the fur trapper neared his destination, an uneasy sense of disquiet washed over him. Something seemed off, almost as if there was a heaviness in the air. LaBelle tried to shake this off and paddled even harder to make it to shore before he lost daylight altogether. An eerie scene greeted LaBelle as he hopped out of his canoe. Things were strangely silent as no one came out of the various tents and huts to greet him. Several fires crackled in the distance, and there was even skinned caribou meat hanging nearby, obviously ready to prepare and cook. Everything seemed as it should be, and nothing was disturbed, save for the fact that there wasn't a soul around. A little spooked, but still not fully alarmed, LaBelle ventured further into the village, his sense of trepidation rising from minute to minute. Upon further investigation, he made a disturbing and heartbreaking find. Several of the village huskies lay dead due to malnutrition and starvation. Even stranger still, several of the grave sites of village elders had been dug up, leaving gaping voids in the frozen earth near the tree line. Thoroughly frightened by this point, Joseph LaBelle hurriedly packed up as many food items and provisions around the village as he could carry. He threw everything back into his canoe and swiftly cast off, wanting to put as much distance between himself and the eerie, deserted village as was humanly possible. As LaBelle paddled away, he looked back and was shocked to find that the village seemed to emanate a soft blue glow from an unknown light source beyond the horizon. Needless to say, this was one of the strangest encounters Joseph LaBelle had ever logged in his many years traversing the Northwest Territories. A contingent of Royal Canadian Mounted Police had been dispatched to a remote outpost near the southern bend of Lake Anjacuni. A few days earlier, they had received a garbled communication from a hospital staff near Manitoba concerning the troubling story of one Joseph LaBelle. In response, a group of mounted police trekked nearly 600 miles to investigate LaBelle's claims. The officers conducted a series of interviews with the various sparse locals and hunters that dotted the area. They were led to the bedside of a badly injured man who had been discovered nearly frozen to death in a snowdrift near Lake Anjacuni. All the man kept muttering about was an ancient forest demon, he said, attacked him during a camping expedition. In addition to this man's testimony, the police also ran across a man named Armand Laurent, who relayed eerie accounts of witnessing strange glowing orbs that had begun to frequent the skies around Lake Anjacuni. Laurent also told the officers of how he felt feelings of dread and bad omen whenever the lights would appear. After several more days, the squad of mounted officers arrived at the location of the Inuit village as described by LaBelle. The same sense of uneasiness descended over the officers that had plagued the fur trapper. The village was dead silent, and it seemed to have been completely deserted. Taking detailed notes as they probed the strange sight, the officers took sharp notice of the dead and decaying remains of the huskies LaBelle had mentioned. Several portions of rotting meat and fish lay undisturbed inside their cooking pots. But the most eerie discovery lay within the small cemetery near the snow-capped tree line. The graves had indeed been dug up, just as LaBelle had said. But what puzzled the officers was that there seemed to be no apparent sign of just how the graves had been exhumed. There weren't any signs of digging tools being used, as the frozen soil around the holes were smooth and pristine. It's almost as if the frozen soil had been lifted right out of the ground using an unknown energy method. The gravestones used to mark the site were laying in two neatly stacked piles nearby, therefore negating the theory of animal predation. Having seen enough, the Royal Mounted Police secured the scene as best they could, roping off a section of the village for potential further probing in the future. They then set off to return to their barracks. A few weeks later, after doing more extensive research, it was found that Joseph LaBelle may not have been as reliable a witness as he let on. Far from being a seasoned hunter, as he purported, it was found that he had only applied for his hunting permit the previous winter and didn't have nearly as much experience as one would have expected. Even more damning to his credibility was the fact that he had allegedly sold his story to the Halifax Herald, a local publication notorious for grossly embellishing its stories. This was apparently enough for the brass at the Royal Mounted Police to half-heartedly dismiss the case as being nothing more than a haphazardly discarded village in the Northern Territories. Chalking it up to the local Inuit pulling up tent stakes and moving on, the case was shelved. It would be briefly revisited in 1935, and the conclusion was that the abandoned village had not been the result of terrorist or criminal acts. That seemed to be good enough for authorities, and the case has since passed into Canadian folklore. but the glaring questions stood out like a sore thumb among some investigators. Even if the mysterious village had not resulted from an act of outright criminality, it did little to explain why a village of about 30 simply picked up and decided to walk away from their settlement without any hint of a rational explanation. Why were their trusted huskies left behind to starve? Why did they not take the various food items they had obviously spent time preparing beforehand? But the biggest question that plagued the minds of researchers was why the villagers felt the need to dig up and remove the bodies of their deceased kin. What could have possibly been the rationale behind these actions? Several years after his encounter, secondhand reports claim that Joseph LaBelle attempted to clear up some of the details of his story. He said that he had been operating for several years without an official hunting permit before authorities forced him to obtain one under threat of a poaching charge. He also claims that he did not explicitly sell his story to the Halifax Herald and that several reporters interviewed him after the fact, but that he received no pay or compensation. LaBelle contends that the mounted police investigation proves that he was truthful about what he saw in the village that night in 1931. As the mysterious case made its rounds, rumblings of a Canadian cover-up began to surface. In backfiled reports, it was alleged that Sergeant J. Nielsen, the officer that had led the squad officers to investigate the village, had made several notes of strange lights in the sky, harassing he and his men as they neared the abandoned village. When he brought this fact up to his superiors, they ordered that he keep this information to himself, suggesting that the Canadian government had something to hide. Several alien enthusiasts cling to the theory that the village was abducted by extraterrestrial beings for unknown reasons. However, others point to the slew of mythical beings and monsters from Inuit folklore. Many of them think that the unfortunate villagers were ambushed by some cryptid as yet unknown to science.
So what are we to make of the mysterious case of the villagers that seem to vanish off the face of the planet? Can the testimony of Joseph LaBelle and Jay Nielsen be truly believed? Did the Halifax Herald embellish what had been reported by LaBelle, or worse yet, did they simply invent the entire story as a fanciful selling point to their readers? Was the Royal Canadian Mounted Police involved in a shadowy cover-up to silence their officers about what they encountered in the frozen tundra of Canada's Northwest Territories? Well, we've presented the evidence as is out there, and we always encourage you to delve deeper to discover the facts for yourself. But if you're ever alone in the rugged wilderness and happen upon an eerily silent village that emanates a sense of foreboding, we strongly urge you to heed the sign posted up at the entrance. The one that warns you to question everything and trust no one. Later.